Hello, and welcome to our Eightfold Cultivate session focused on unlocking untapped potential from U.S. military veterans and spouses. Today, we'll learn from two esteemed military veterans. Marc Lopez, Nationwide's Director of Talent Acquisition Process Management Team and Associates Program. Marc reports to Angela Bretz, the Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer for Nationwide. He's also responsible for the core operations and new technology-driven innovation in talent acquisition at Nationwide. Marc graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point with a Bachelor of Science degree. He served in the Army as a captain in the 1st Squadron, 10th Cavalry, aka the Buffalo Soldiers. He was also a Deputy United States Marshal before making the transition to corporate life. We're also joined by my colleague, Don Moore. Don leads Eightfold's military community outreach enablement efforts as a dedicated solutions consultant. He advises on product development and customer adoption from a unique perspective, both as a 24-year military veteran through 15 years post-service in corporate talent acquisition at enterprises like Gulfstream Aerospace, General Dynamic Mission Systems, and more. Thank you guys so much for being here today. You know, one of the places I think we should start is understanding what your service was like and what your first roles coming out of the service were in a more civilian workforce environment. So Marc, can you walk us through what your service looked like and then the transition to the civilian workforce?
Oh, absolutely, Maher, and thank you for having me here. I think, I started off again like most people after being in the Army for a 9-year period, and 5 of that active duty. One of the things that I looked at is, something related to the government that I was really comfortable in. So I did some time in federal law enforcement, was a U.S. Marshal for a 3-year period in Philadelphia. And then some of the surrounding areas in Allentown and Easton in Pennsylvania. It was also a little bit closer to my family, but it's something I was comfortable with, and I always wanted to go into law enforcement. My family has a history of joining the military, whether it's Army or Marine Corps or Navy, and then also doing a little bit of law enforcement. Some stay, some don't. And when I went into law enforcement for a bit, I wanted to go ahead and make a shift after a while. So, I mean, if you think about it, it's been a long time when you're doing those type of jobs at that rate. I was looking a little bit of long term wanted to step out and have a family, kind of like get back to a quote unquote normal life. So I stepped into a realm where I went into manufacturing with the company and tried my foot there, and then a couple of other areas. I think the one thing that I learned from that experience was, making the transition from the military, especially in a combat arms role, to, where you're taught to fight for a living. It's hard for you to get your arms around and think about how you can translate those skills into project management skills or other supervisory skills, or, how to run logistics and things of that nature, which there's a lot of the same type of that and personnel management that goes on in the civilian world. And then I moved into several other roles, which got me into more of a operational Lean Six Sigma, black belt type, and then strategic planning roles. But I would say definitely when I got out initially, I was kind of testing the waters of different areas, and I may or may like about it. What I learned from manufacturing is that it's a tough job, which I knew, but manufacturing wasn't for me. And then I moved into other areas. But initially, I'd say the transition did take me a little bit. It took me 3 months to find a job, and it's not always the easiest out there, even when you have a lot of people who are recruiters or headhunting groups, trying to pull you in. It's very hard for you to even get grounded in what you think you might like and what you want to do going forward for the next few years. But I'd say my advice to folks is that try something and don't be afraid to make a change. Don't stick with something that you're not happy or comfortable with, because if you're not happy at work, you're going to bring that home too to your family.
You brought up 3 things that I just want to highlight for a minute because I thought it was interesting hearing you talk through that. One is there are transferable skills that you may not have in context of the transferable skills. Right? You talked about project management, multitasking, teamwork, and so as a veteran, thinking about your skills not in terms of what you did, but what skills you actually brought to the or you learned, or what is transferable across your experiences and what is being asked for in a particular job. I think the second thing that's really interesting about what you said is the networking side of things, because I'll put some words in your mouth a little bit here, but there's an ambiguity associated with civilian workforce. What's next for me? I've got to go figure that out. There's no set path as there is in a military, right? And there's a process of doing that that requires resilience, that requires confidence, and requires testing. And that could take days, weeks, months, even years to figure out what the right path is. And then the third thing that I thought was really interesting about what you said is don't be afraid to ask for something. And people are willing to help when you ask for it. And so I think those are just great tips and tricks from what I think what sounds like is sometimes can be self-limiting opportunities for self-limiting behavior from veterans as they think about what can I do in the civilian workforce.
Absolutely.
Don, I'd love to hear about your transition from your military service into the civilian workforce. Can you walk us through how you did that?
Absolutely. Thanks for hearing it. And it's great to be here with Mark. My story's somewhat similar, 24 years, a little bit different on the different service, Air Force. But I had a similar experience where I actually got out twice. So I've kind of got a double resume on talking about what it is like to step out into the world from military skills and look for something else. The first time I did it, I was actually offered an opportunity, a business opportunity, and it was truly through networking. It was all about someone that I knew and a networking opportunity. And it's something that these folks would have never discovered me, never known about me based off of my military skills. In my time in the Air Force, I was really most of my career working in secure communications, those sort of things where, when they're in the underground and they go down the rabbit hole and they turn off all the lights and there's big screens on the wall and you're doing strategic stuff. So it's an interesting thing that even things you do in your career you can't always talk about, but yet when it comes time to separate, to get out, you got to get that skill set out there. So I had a struggle with that a little bit when I stepped out. The first time, again, discovered for something totally different than what I was doing, purely through networking. The opportunity didn't work out, so I actually came back in again. And I came back in this time through the Air Force Reserve versus active, but I was full-time. And I got to realize a passion in recruiting. I had always wanted to do it on active duty, but I was limited in the skills that they trained me on and taught me in the first place. And they felt they had a vested interest in a security clearance and the things that I had been taught, and branching out just wasn't an option. Not really a fair thing, and we talk about in today's world about talent mobility. It was something that just wasn't looked at very, very clearly. And so I got the opportunity by coming back in to dive into my passion and to get into the recruiting world. And so that I got to do for another 6 years and loved every bit of it. And what I learned from that and sort of took me through the rest of my career was that besides the fact that, when we stepped out, we had not a lot of help out there. We might know people, but there were not as many resources as we'd like to have. And there was no concept of personal branding. There was no way that you really knew how to represent yourself multifaceted to the various jobs that you thought you could do. And so, on two different ends there, it was a dilemma. I don't know what they want, and I don't know what all I can do, but I know I've got some skills here that are probably not represented properly in my resume. So throughout my Air Force career, I definitely got to build a lot of different things, but those were locked in a box and they were not necessarily things that I could get out. And so having stepped in and stepped out twice and gone through the military transition assistance program, very helpful, but also very limited in many ways. And I was excited when after I stepped out of the military, I got in with industry and actually became that other side of the coin. I was in military outreach looking for that same talent that I used to be. And the idea there was hopefully at least I had a little bit of empathy to what they were trying to convey and a little bit more of an ability to say, here's what the company's trying to find. And so that's where a lot of this comes into play. And I know we're going to talk more about those sorts of things, but that interplay between the haves and the have-nots and the what I want to be's and does anyone really understand that is a very interesting dynamic. And I think that today's world is helping veterans better than it used to.
Don, Mark just laid out a really holistic, phenomenal way to think about how to bridge the gap between veterans and recruiters in the civilian workforce. Can you help us understand a bit of what you would do at Eightfold and why you came to Eightfold?
Absolutely. And to hear the things that Mark was talking about was really exciting to me because it's sort of a reality that I lived as well in a similar role. And so, the wonderful things that get done maybe don't get noticed or don't get exposed to a veteran audience. You've got all these super things you're doing in your company, but yet Maybe you're in an industry that was just never considered by someone stepping out of a skill set that just had no adjacency to it. And so it was a frustration for me in my many years of working around the Beltway here in DC and in other corporations, that those things couldn't get matched up, although many great things were being done. And so with Eightfold, and when I was approached, again, from a perspective of, we've got an idea about how these things can be matched up, how the unknowns can be known to those that just wish they knew more. And it was very intriguing to me. And from where I'd lived and had that experience in helping veterans and helping employers, I thought, okay, well, talk to me a little more. And so as I learned, then I was exposed to it, and then ultimately talked to become part of this great company, I found out that it really is it's a matching issue. It has to do with these things that need to be unearthed. And what if there was a way that can put basically a recruiter on a hypergear, because having done that for many years in the recruiting world, I can't speak for all of them, but one of the more mundane things that you do is sourcing, where you're out there just hitting it in the old school with Boolean searches and looking through a variety of places to find this great talent, and it's just not being exposed to you. So my role here at Eightfold has been to sort of interject into the platform and talk about, hey, here's what we're looking at. We're looking at the same similarities we talk about with anyone searching for a job, but we've got this unique audience. We've got these what we call TSMs, these transitioning service members. We have the spouses, and we have the veteran population, those that have already gone before, like myself and Mark. So we've got that group of people. We have these employers that, again, have these skill sets that are just not translating, and that is the big issue that's always been around this world, is the translation thereof. And how can we make those two parties come together? And so I'm very excited that's what the artificial intelligence is doing. And I've also been able to reach out to my fellow brothers and sisters in the recruiting world and tell them, this is not a threat. This is absolutely a tool that you need, because this is going to be a force multiplier, as we like to say in the military, for what you're trying to accomplish. So think about it in terms of all the things that Mark mentioned that they're doing, right down to their ERGs, right down to their awards that they've had, right down to the things that their management is doing in a very specific process. I want to make sure that those things get exposed. The separating service member doesn't know. And as I mentioned earlier, they just might not be thinking of Nationwide. They may not be thinking of that as a place where their skill sets could actually fit. Truth is, there's probably, and Mark has found, there are many, many things that they've done that are absolutely what they're looking for. And there was just that mystery box, as I talked about there before. So what we're trying to do, and what we're absolutely able to do now, is to surface those things. And one of the things that is misunderstood about that is that goes beyond those skill sets. We talk about adjacency and soft skills, the ability to surface things like leadership. One of the things that comes into play a lot of times that's missing for a service member is camaraderie, esprit de corps, that family atmosphere. And yet, if you take the employer side, oftentimes these large companies are out looking and vying for these great places to work, awards that they're looking for. It's the same thing. We want that atmosphere that makes it welcoming and comfortable. And yet that miscommunication often leads to a place where I just don't think they would understand what I want to do and understand where I'm coming from, and they don't understand exactly my mindset in this. So camaraderie and a great place to work come to play when we find that we can pull those together, which are often, again, misidentified. We have a lot of common ground there. And then another thing that I found, which I was frustrated with out in the corporate world and in the companies that we're hiring, is my job descriptions just didn't make it. They just didn't resonate. And so, when I got to be involved with Eightfold, I found that what can happen, and what absolutely does happen, is we make a job description. We help this entity make a job description that hunts for itself. If you think about military folks, they're used to being mission oriented. So there's a mission that's called for. That's the same thing as a company has. There's a mission, but there's unique skills that are needed, and they go out and find them from a common database because they know what they do in uniform. So when a company's looking, it's got a mission as well, but it might not understand what those folks in uniform are or what they do. So the matching component there is incredibly important. And as we do that, we're actually making them hunt for themselves.
You spent the better part of the back half of 2019 and 2020 working on an initiative that actually did that translation and helped train the AI around it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I would love to, absolutely. We've been involved with the Department of Labor's Employment Veterans Challenge. Essentially, what this was, the Department of Labor went out and said, we need to enhance the Transition Assistance Program, commonly known as TAP, among the military services. And what that is, of course, is the mechanism where service members are assisted when they get out to find employment. A few years back, they realized in the Department of Defense that they put a lot of time and effort into bringing folks in, but then when it came time to separate, because not everyone stays and not everyone can stay, the system is not built for that. But when it comes to that place, let's assist them getting out. But they had found many, many deficiencies in that. So the Department of Labor said, look, how can we approach industry to find out a better way to essentially match these individuals and these skills, all the things that I've talked about before, with these employers that are so hungry for that. This challenge was issued. It was done in a sense of multiple companies applied, over 50, and it went through about 5 different rounds of elimination. And thankfully, Eightfold, we were selected as the choice for the Department of Labor to enable TAP and to change their curriculum to such that this platform now will be standard operating procedure after we go through the pilot and work out, the various ways that we want each service to use it. But it will become the standard for using a tool to put your information in and actually find those positions, those careers. And I say that because it goes more than the job. It goes to careers that you could do and that you want to do. And it's got so many components to it that are above and beyond even the great matching that I've talked about. We look at what kind of skills you might need. Where's the gap analysis? What kind of things can you do in your last year of service that would make a difference when you actually go out and interview and apply for these positions? And how can Eightfold help identify those courses for you? How can we point you in the right direction for looking at things like doing apprenticeships and those sorts of things with companies? How can we help point you based off of what you told us in your skill set to the welcoming arms of an employer that will understand what you're doing? An important thing that we've done too is we look at a lot of different data that we take in, that we ingest into the system. And the standard resume is not really a viable tool for the average service member. They get to put that together in that last 2 or 3 months that they're in when they're going to a mandatory class for transition assistance. And they're said, okay, let's build a resume, because they're not used and they're not needed in the military structure. However, of course, we all know that that's what the standard has been. But with AI and the ingestion of data, we can say, look, we want to talk to you about other things that you've got. There's a VMET, which is a verification of military education and training. It's a bedrock for what a resume would consist of. We want to know about the awards and decorations that you got. We want to know about the personnel evaluations that you had, right down to the extra skills that you had, safety, things with security that were not even part of your job per se. Ingest all of that. And now what you have is a much richer candidate profile that I like to say it's like a Rubik's Cube. You spin it around and you can see it from a lot of different dimensions. That's what makes this so much more interesting to the employer, because time and resources are important, as we know. So think about the fact that they can look at this and be able to pull more specifically for what they want. And having used our technology to calibrate their job descriptions and make them wider and more accepting, now we've got a win-win situation, because we have basically a catcher's mitt that's ready to receive a pitch. And both of these things are going to marry up properly because of the AI we do. And it was my experience from being in the military, having worked both sides of it as a recruiter, putting them in, as someone that hired them out, that's where there was a real need. And so exciting work that we've got going on here with Eightfold. And this is why this conversation is just so interesting to me, because when you hear about what Nationwide is doing and the things that they can showcase about themselves, and then we talk about how we can showcase an actual veteran that's getting out, we marry those two up and we have a really exciting proposition.
Well, what you described is really using technology to augment the training and open the aperture for a recruiter to understand what people are actually capable of. And that gives them time and bandwidth then to go through the training and the programmatic components that Marc laid out, right? So they're spending less time having to think about it themselves, because the technology is already turbo boosting them with some of this, with the work that you put in, with the AI that's constantly learning. And now the recruiters, the recruiting team, the hiring managers have a much better idea when they go into a conversation what someone's real skills or capabilities are, and they can focus on the other aspects, right? And then figure out the why yes in a much more sort of seamless and hopefully quicker fashion. So let's take this one step further. Mark and Don, one of the things that both of you have alluded to is service members oftentimes have to move very frequently. And the impact is not only on them, it's also on their spouses and their families. And so as hiring managers and recruiters think about the military ecosystem, spouses are a huge part of it. Mark, I'd love to ask you about this, right? How do you, in the interview cycle and the screening cycle, understand if someone is a spouse? And then how do you guys train to help bridge that gap for spouses of veterans?
Again, being with the forthcoming part, when you look at someone's resume and you see that there's a lot of time within there, but you like the experience they have, is just be forthcoming and say, hey, I see you've moved around a lot. Is there a reason for that, right? Excuse me. I think that's one of the biggest things. Again, it goes with the advice that we talked about earlier with the hiring manager. Like, go a few questions deeper on that if you're not getting the answer you want. I think it's a little bit of a twofold thing. I think that we can educate the talent acquisition folks to go ahead and recognize that. And then all the data you pull, and we pull tons of it too, where you see that, military spouses and the makeup of DOD. And I think we hit our peak of just over 20 million veterans. And now we're downsizing a little as far as that as the years pass in the country, especially workforce available. I think one of the biggest things we have to look at is when you're asking folks, why did they move around like that? Realize that they have the skills and the skill sets from the jobs that they performed. It's not a willingness on their part to go ahead and move, right? Like Don was saying, they're moving around because they're following that their significant other around to different parts of the country because of what's deemed. And I mean, especially if you go for command for a couple of years, then you go to more schooling, then you go to a functional area job, then you come back and go to more schooling, then you go to another place where you're a staff person, and then maybe you might go to command there, but then you're going to move. All of these are constant moves all the time that, people don't realize that you have to make if you're going to make a career out of any military branch, right? Every 2 or 3 years, you're changing jobs and or locations, right? At a time. I think the one biggest thing we look for is to make sure that we're, upfront with the candidates and asking them, why did this occur and things of that nature. The thing that I think, though, if you look at, sometimes the local economy with people who are moving and around a base, sometimes they won't hire like even smaller companies that are around a base because they know you're going to leave. So then you have that trouble that you can't even get a job, just making some cash to bring some into the family because they're looking for someone longer term who's going to actually stay in that area. I think that the nuance of the cultural change, and Don hit it on the head perfectly with COVID, is COVID's proved people can do a lot of work productively from home. So if you apply that to the spousal issue that we're talking about, companies have to get over the hump. And I would say the onus is really on medium to large size companies, not always corporate nature, but just as depth, who are spread out over the US or even overseas in different areas. Is you can have someone who stays with your company for a long time who could just pick up their laptop now and their docking station and move around to different areas and complete that same job. I think more of it is the cultural aspect of these companies realizing, and I think COVID did a good job at proving this, although I would say you still culturally, you always have some people who are adverse to change or holding out or saying, well, I'd rather have them in the office. But the question I would ask them is why? There are some roles, yes, I get it. We need to come in. It's good for team building, that nature. But if you think about it, some people live in a grand metro area. You spend 1 to 2 hours commuting every day. You're losing that time, right? You have someone who's a spouse who's work from home. If they're able to be flexible, and take care of household needs of that work and get the work done that you need, customer service center aside, I get there's certain set hours, but even then we have them work from home too, right? But you have to be more open to the idea that if someone's physically not in the office, they're still productive and getting work done. And I think some companies, depending on the culture and how long they've been around, have a hard time getting used to that. But while some of the newer tech or startup companies or things like that I think they're proving everyone wrong, because as long as the internet's working and what we're using, you could go ahead. And a lot of the work today is done via email, via conferences, via shared collaboration type of software. no matter what it is, you're going to get productivity out of that person. And if they're comfortable making a sacrifice while they follow their spouse around who's in the military and want to do that next job for the next 10, 15, 20 years, stay in that role, like, then why avoid that person, right? Why not have that person hired? I think that's something that some companies have to come face to face with now. And then, like Don was saying, is, hey, this is, COVID did a good job at proving a lot of this. So, and that's where I think that the opportunity for military spouses is even greater now. We've talked to it, and there was some, as far as we in the community, right, have talked to it, but there's some companies who took the lead with it. And I know locally, and they've had great success with it, and they're multinational companies, and the spouses have moved all over. Even some went to Germany, and you know what? They're still employed by the company. So it's feasible. It really is that, everybody, whether you're really open-minded or not, everybody has a little trepidation about change, no matter, and that's what I still think is holding some of us back. But I'm hoping that we take a step back and realize that COVID has proved that the military spouse work from home option would be a great way to go ahead and keep those types of folks employed and then gainfully employed, and also less stress on the service members' families, because every time they move, they don't have to go looking for another job.
What you're describing, Mark, it's remarkable, right? There are not only with veterans a massive untapped talent potential that hasn't fully been realized yet, but that's only half of the battle. There's actually a fully untapped market in terms of spouses. When you think about bringing talent into an organization, especially in a hybrid or a distributed workforce environment, and it requires a little bit of work internally. But take this full circle back to the playbook you gave us on the front end of this conversation. That's a flywheel effect of having not just veterans as a part of your ERG, but also those who want to be supportive and who have never served or been a spouse, but then also the spousal point of view and perspective. And that education within your organization, creates this flywheel effect. And I love the way you've sort of laid this out through the course of our conversation today. Just in wrapping, I want to say, Mark and Don, first and foremost, thank you for your service. Secondarily, thank you for paying it forward. The work that you guys do and continue to do on a daily, weekly, yearly basis is certainly paying it forward. We at Eightfold hope to use our technology to help amplify and augment some of the work that you guys have put in over the past several decades. For those of you in the audience, thank you for your time. If you have any questions or any follow-ups, please feel free to reach out directly to Mark or to Don. As we can tell, there's a lot of passion around this, and this is a core part of our careers. And so, thank you for your time. Thank you for your service, and hope you guys have a great day.